Titchener, in fact, was the best known structuralist, and because of certain limitations in the school called structuralism, he did not get many followers, and after some time the school seems to have died a natural death with Titchener. What were the basic limitations of the school called structuralism? First of all, it was taken to be a very narrow approach, looking at consciousness and mental processes simply in terms of the building blocks that they are made up of, without looking at other aspects that give richness to the same experiences. Secondly, the experimental method as used in a typical experiment is objective, and to the extent that the structuralists proposed and used this method, there were no objections. But when it came to something called experimental self-observation or introspection, the extreme subjectivity of this method was something that did not fit into the science of psychology as it was intended to be. The biggest difficulty with something as subjective as introspection is that it is not verifiable, because the person simply narrates or goes through one's own personal experience without objectifying it. However, it should be realized that the kind of information that could be obtained through introspection could not in fact be obtained through any other method, and in that sense then introspection as proposed by the structuralists was in fact not substitutable by any other method. The third limitation attributed to the school called structuralism was that the idea of studying consciousness by analyzing it into its elements, what was called an atomistic approach, was not acceptable to many psychologists. Notable among the opponents of this idea was this very famous American psychologist philosopher named William James. We now move on to the second school called functionalism. William James was a big name when he came on the scene, primarily trained in philosophy, but also extremely familiar with basic areas such as general psychology and physiological psychology. According to William James, psychology is the scientific study of consciousness. Although consciousness is also an expression of what we call the mind, it was the term and the idea of consciousness that William James emphasized and highlighted. But he believed that this scientific study of consciousness should be not in terms of units or building blocks, but as a continuous flowing stream, because that is what consciousness is. To quote William James from his book named Principles of Psychology, Volume 1, published in 1890, "No one ever had a simple sensation by itself. Consciousness is of a teeming multiplicity of objects and relations, and what we call simple sensations are results of discriminative attention, pushed often to a very high degree." One can see then that right from the beginning, William James was emphasizing the fact that what we know as consciousness, first of all, can only be experienced, and secondly, it is a seamless flow that cannot be cut up or stopped anywhere in between. A common saying is, "You never step into a river twice." Now that expresses in a sense the kind of idea that William James was trying to portray about what he thought consciousness was. James was basically a philosopher, but he had an excellent understanding of basic mental processes such as sensation, consciousness, perception, attention, memory, associations, reasoning, imagination, emotion, and will. He was sometimes described as a pre-functionalist because the school called functionalism had not formally taken off with William James. William James was also familiar with work in the area of physiological psychology, and he made ample use of this in his book Principles of Psychology. James was greatly influenced by Charles Darwin, the great biologist, and his evolution-related propositions, primarily those such as adaptation and survival. He extended these concepts to the arena of consciousness. He supported the experimental method in the study of mental processes, and he made a distinction between non-empirical mental philosophy, we have mentioned this earlier, the kind of study of certain ideas that are related to the mind, but can be studied without methods such as the experimental method or even introspection. But he made this distinction so that it becomes clear that when we study mental processes as part of psychology, we also study consciousness, we can use methods that are in fact empirical in nature. But what is interesting is that William James himself was not a strong experimentalist. In other words, he never spent a lot of his time conducting experiments on the mental processes and consciousness that he so elaborately and beautifully described. William James also contributed theoretically to several topics in psychology. But the most important contribution made by William James was that his ideas strengthened the school called functionalism. There are some other functionalists whose names need to be mentioned here. One was John Dewey, who was known to be a philosopher as well as an educationist. James Angel, considered by many to be the main functionalist, in fact the person who pioneered this school, and Harvey Carr, who incorporated some tenets of behaviorism into his view of functionalism. What were the main ideas of functionalism? First of all functionalists believed that psychology is indeed the scientific study of mental processes and consciousness. In this respect, they resembled the structuralists. Secondly, consciousness is to be understood as a stream and not in terms of elements or units. And third, consciousness or mental processes should be studied in terms of their adaptive value and in terms of their utility or applicability. In accordance with the emphasis on adaptive value, the notion of individual differences was also a significant topic of study. We will see later on how individual differences took on a very different form and in fact a very elaborate form when we get to the discussion of the contemporary scenario in psychology. The age-old question of the mind-body component was also taken up in functionalism. They tended to incline towards the monistic view about this relationship, proposing that essentially the mind and body do merge with each other, and therefore the distinction between mental processes and physical processes ultimately is not extremely meaningful. Along with the experimental method that they supported, they accepted introspection as a method, but not of the very subjective kind that was propagated and used by Titchener. Let us look at some of the contributions made by the school called functionalism. We notice that there is a great variety in the areas of research and the methods they adopted. Theoretical areas such as sensation and perception were studied, but so were applied fields such as education, advertising, and personnel selection. The functionalists carried out animal research, which now would be called comparative psychology. They also did some work on mental testing or psychometry. In fact, it is known that some of the noted functionalists used questionnaires and other tools, for example, intelligence tests and personality tests in this connection. They contributed to diverse areas such as mental health, gender differences, motivation, and child development. So one wonders if there was any area of study in any branch of psychology that was really left untouched by the functionalists. Overall, however, functionalism as a school of psychology did not have much influence on the growth of psychology. We now move to the next school of thought in psychology. Behaviorism appeared as a new school with a different approach to the study of psychology compared to structuralism and functionalism. Two major names were linked to behaviorism, namely that of John Watson and B.F. Skinner. It is John Watson who is known as the founder of the school called behaviorism. Watson's views can be summarized as follows. First of all, he believed that psychology is the scientific study of behavior, and here is a quotation that sums up very nicely what Watson viewed should be the aim of studying psychology. He says, psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. He was vehemently opposed to the idea of studying concepts such as mind and consciousness as the subject matter of psychology. In addition, he rejected the use of introspection as a method because he believed that it was too subjective to be considered scientific. In addition, Watson believed that behavior can be studied and understood as a series of systematic, learned and simple stimulus-response associations. So, this phrase stimulus-response or SR associations became the hallmark of the school called behaviorism. This idea essentially implied that there was actually no need for any abstract concept like mind, and this attitude or approach was called anti-mentalism. Instead of studying the mind or consciousness, what Watson believed was that physiological and biological processes underlying SR associations should be examined. Watson supported the idea of classical conditioning, a process that had been discovered by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, as a form of learned SR relationships. This process was made famous by some other psychologists as well. He analyzed aspects such as instincts, which referred to indication of learning, and sensory functions as well. In other words, Watson, like many of the other SR associationists, was steeped in the training that he had in terms of biology and physiology. He also believed in using animals as research subjects in order to understand human behavior, particularly learning and its underlying physiological processes. This might sound like a resemblance between the functionalist school and the behaviorist school, but then this resemblance only went up to a certain extent. Watson also felt that learning and environmental influences are more important than genetic factors in determining behavior. This is often referred to as the empiricist view to behavior. In general, there has been a controversy which is known as the nature-nurture controversy, and clearly Watson and his school of thought, he supported the idea of nurture rather than nature. With regard to method, he strongly supported the experimental method as the only acceptable, objective and therefore scientific way to study behavior. There was no question about using any method such as introspection because it was simply too subjective. He contributed to the study of learning as a psychological process. What also has to be kept in mind is that Watson, when he started his career, was actually involved in a business of advertising, first of all with somebody else's firm and then as a person in the executive role for that firm. Now, advertising is of course an applied area, and one initially cannot see the connection between Watson's fundamental views about behavior and the job that he was doing. But then his academic life took him on a very different path, and that is what we now know as behaviorism. One other psychologist who probably became more famous than John Watson himself was B.F. Skinner. In fact, the association between B.F. Skinner's name and the school of thought called behaviorism is so strong that the first name that comes up in mind when the school is mentioned is actually Skinner and not Watson. But actually, Skinner was deeply influenced by not only Watson, but by many other SR learning theorists. Some of these names will be mentioned as we go along. And his main work carried forward Watson's school of thought. He continued the emphasis on behavior as the subject matter of psychology, rejecting things like consciousness and mind. SR associations, according to Skinner also, was seen as the basis of learning, and learning is what summed up the study of behavior. Skinner also, like Watson, rejected the need for including mind or mental in the understanding of behavior. Skinner, in fact, is considered to be a radical behaviorist. A little more will be said about what that implies a little later. Skinner proposed a theory based on what he called the experimental analysis of behavior. He agreed with the idea of classical conditioning, but in addition to that idea, he proposed his own form of conditioning, which went by the name of operant conditioning. This idea, in fact, created a kind of storm even in the area of learning, and it brought in a breath of fresh air in the kind of conceptualization of the learning process itself. The main tenet of operant conditioning was as follows: all behavior is the result of learning that specific responses are instrumental in leading to specific pleasant or unpleasant consequences. Essentially then, operant conditioning is described as learning on the basis of consequences. Now, the typical SR associationist idea implied that a stimulus leads to a response, which also fits in with common sense. Here Skinner was pointing out that although that is in fact correct, that stimulus does lead to response, there is another way of looking at this learning process, and that is to see how a response in terms of what consequence it leads to can also become the basis of learning, and hence it would be correct to describe the kind of learning that Skinner emphasized as RS learning instead of SR learning. In other words, he has emphasized a little more than SR learning as was proposed in classical conditioning. Operant conditioning contained the features of prediction and control of behavior, which was very much in accordance with the goals of psychology as a science, according to Watson. The core process in Skinnerian conditioning or operant conditioning consists of reinforcement and/or punishment as the basis of learning through operant conditioning. When we get into a detailed discussion of the learning process, a distinction will be made between the concept of reinforcement and punishment and some other forms of the two, such as negative reinforcement, omission training, and so on. Skinner accepted only the experimental method as scientific, and like Watson, he also believed in using animals as experimental subjects to establish his major theory. In fact, many students of psychology begin by asking this question: if operant conditioning experiments involved animals, can we safely extend or apply the findings to human learning? The answer, according to Skinner, is an emphatic yes. As part of the procedure for studying operant conditioning, Skinner devised what is even now called the Skinner box, which was a special apparatus that allowed the observer to watch what the animal was doing as the learning process called operant conditioning took place. Along with the Skinner box, he also designed a cumulative recorder that would automatically record the responses made by the animal. The idea of operant conditioning was applied to other forms of learning which applied to human life, such as self-instructed and programmed learning. In fact, Skinner created something called the teaching machine, which allows a student not only to learn on his own, but also on the basis of a form of reinforcement or punishment. So, for instance, if a paragraph is given as part of a lesson, the student can read the paragraph, answer the questions that follow that paragraph, but then the answers that he gives to each of the questions will be graded by the machine as correct or incorrect as the case would be. Depending on whether the answers were correct or incorrect, the student would get reinforcement or punishment, and that would in turn affect his pace of learning. That, in short, was the principle behind the teaching machine. Another application, which was in fact a little controversial, was the idea of using pigeons to guide missiles in combat. This was started as an experimental demonstration in some of the experiments that Skinner himself conducted, and Skinner felt, it is said, that the Army in the United States did not pay sufficient attention to or take cognizance of the contributions that his theory could make. What are the positive aspects of Skinner's view? First of all, it is precise, there is no question about it. Secondly, it helped in predicting behavior under certain conditions, and Skinner was quite sure that if those conditions can be presented in a controlled way, that would very easily help us to predict under what conditions, what kind and what rate of responses would be made. One example of this is Skinner's idea of the schedule of reinforcement, which once again will be taken up in detail when we get into our study of the learning processes. He drew attention to other forms of SR learning also, such as Edward Thorndike's trial and error or instrumental learning. Thorndike is classified as an SR associationist or SR learning theorist, but he does not belong to the school of thought called behaviorism as such, and yet the basic principle illustrated in Thorndike's instrumental learning was in many respects extremely similar to the Skinnerian idea of operant conditioning. A second form of learning which has already been referred to was Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning, which once again involved a special form of associationist learning, not based on consequences, but on the time relationship between two kinds of stimuli. A third example of an SR theory, which does not strictly fit into behaviorism but is closely connected to it, is Clark Hull's drive reduction theory, which emphasized the motivational aspect of what Skinner otherwise called reinforcement. Skinner's theory threw light on possible applications of a simple notion, namely SR association, and that in fact did add value to this otherwise rather mechanical theory. But in addition to these positive aspects, of course, there were certain limitations. The strongest limitation probably was that this theory ignored the cognitive aspect. It was too narrow and too mechanistic. It could not explain a whole range of processes that we not only experience in real life, but also have to pass on, for instance, by way of teaching and instruction to students. So if a question is asked, can Skinner's theory explain how problem solving is learned? Probably the answer would be not so easily. One contribution that was made by Skinner's theory is that because of some of its limitations and some of the gaps in information that it left unfilled, it gave rise to another school of thought connected to behaviorism, which is better termed neo-behaviorism or cognitive behaviorism, and this is contrasted with radical behaviorism. As was mentioned earlier, Skinner is classified as a radical behaviorist who would not allow any cognitive concept to enter into the picture that he painted in terms of reinforcement-based learning. On the other hand, the cognitive behaviorists did allow for some cognitive explanations for the relationship that is formed between a stimulus and a response in the learning process. Some examples of the cognitive aspects of SR learning can be found, for example, in the idea of expectation and informativeness as it has been brought into classical conditioning. A straightforward cognitive concept cannot be really identified that easily, even in those researchers' work that came after Skinner, and yet there were many of them who did acknowledge the gaps that were left in terms of cognitive concepts in the original theory proposed by Skinner by way of operant conditioning. The neo-behaviorist tradition, in fact, brought in a different idea, and that is best exemplified by the theory proposed by a person called Edward Tolman. For many writing on psychological history, Tolman must have been a very courageous person because, in a sense, he took on Skinner, who was a very major figure in his time. Tolman initially started out as a behaviorist in terms of the methodological approach, in the sense that he supported the experimental method as was followed by many of his predecessors, including the SR theorists. However, he differed in very fundamental ways from both Skinner and the other SR theorists. The first point of departure between Tolman and the other SR theorists was that Tolman emphasized a stimulus-stimulus or SS relationship rather than SR or RS relationship in learning. He also de-emphasized in a rather prominent way the role of reinforcement as a necessary component of learning and gave priority to a more cognitive concept which he termed cognitive map. In the experiments conducted by Tolman, it was clearly shown that reinforcement is not necessary for the process of learning, although it may become important for what we call performance. In other words, if a learned response has to be expressed to the outer world, then perhaps reinforcement does become an important feature, although maybe still not necessary. But then this also makes us wonder, is learning the same thing as performance, something that a behaviorist, a radical behaviorist would definitely agree to, or does a distinction have to be made between a process of learning as such and the role that we give to performance, which is the external expression of something that we have learned? Needless to say, Tolman did not have many supporters in the beginning, but at least he had made his point. The world of psychology at that time, which was to a very large extent in support of the Skinnerian view of learning, did start thinking about the cognitive components that had in many ways been left out of original orthodox Skinnerian learning, operant conditioning and other similar SR forms of learning. Along came another school which in fact does not get mentioned very commonly and yet needs to be mentioned here, and that was the Gestalt school of thought. The founders of this school are this triumvirate called Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka and Wolfgang Köhler. Probably, as was mentioned, this is the least known school of thought, but it cannot be said that it made no impact on psychology and the growth of this discipline. The best known statement that is once again a hallmark of the school of thought is this maxim: the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Popularly, the statement is known as the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which does not in fact go against the maxim as it was originally expressed. The idea behind this maxim was to caution against the unitary or atomist approach taken by structuralists and behaviorists. As you will recall, both the schools of structuralism and behaviorism believed in breaking up whatever they were studying into components. In the case of structuralism, it was what they called the building blocks of consciousness and experience and mental processes in general. In the case of behaviorism, it was the breaking up of what they call behavior into smaller units called SR units, or according to Skinner, RS units. The Gestalt school pointed out that studying merely the parts will provide only an incomplete or even a misleading picture, because the configurational or Gestalt component is left out completely. What is therefore needed is to seriously take into account the Gestalt, which refers to the total form or the configuration, and this illustrates a holistic approach. Many everyday examples of phenomena were studied to illustrate the idea of the Gestalt, such as the phi phenomenon. Now, just to give a little example of what the phi phenomenon would mean is as follows. Very often we see that there are, whenever there is a case of illumination, there are moving lights, or rather, to put it more correctly, there are lights that seem to be moving in continuity. Actually, we all know that each of those lights is a stationary point and they follow an on-off sequence. But this sequence of on or off comes so quickly, so rapidly, that the transition is not noticeable. Now, this Max Wertheimer took as an example of the Gestalt principle of continuity, and initially it posed a puzzle because people would not understand why stationary points of light that are just going on or off could be seen as streaming in continuity. But then these Gestalt psychologists pointed out exactly how that is happening. Two principles that were emphasized in the Gestalt school are the principle of totality, which means that in understanding conscious experience, all aspects, including the mental and the physical, must be taken together in an integrated rather than a piecemeal way. The second principle is something called psychophysical isomorphism. That refers to the individual's conscious experiences having a counterpart in brain activity. In actuality, this idea was not specifically proven by research, but was a hypothetical idea that did hold some promise and could be tested. The Gestalt psychologists supported the experimental approach, but they proposed that experiments should be more realistic, not confined to the laboratory, because the lab kind of experiment may make the situation very rigid, and then there would be problems of generalizing the findings outside the lab. They contributed mainly to the area of perception, thanks to the efforts of Wertheimer and Kafka, but also to learning, and this was brought about by Köhler's proposition of the theory of insight learning, a cognitive form of learning that emphasizes the fact that we learn principles and not responses. They also stressed other processes with a molar rather than a molecular approach. That is, they proposed that one should take a holistic, a global approach rather than an atomistic or unitary approach. Numerous practical applications of the Gestalt principles can be found, for example, in the area of design. Some familiar applications are those of the principles of perceptual organization, such as continuity, closure, proximity or similarity, figure ground perception, and apparent movement. We would see a few examples of these very soon. The Gestalt school influenced other theorists in fields outside perception and learning, and probably the best example of this is Kurt Lewin's field theory, which was extended further into group dynamics as a part of social psychology, looking at the context of behavior in the social surrounding. After all this was done now, there is this one school of thought that simply cannot be left out, because it did really bring in a kind of revolution. And yes, we are talking about this very well-known school called psychoanalysis. Indeed, this school of thought in psychology can be considered revolutionary in more than one sense. The founder of the school was Sigmund Freud, now almost like a household name, not just among psychology students and teachers and researchers, but also among people who are in literature and probably in some other areas as well, such as art. This school of thought is seen not just as a school of thought, but also as a theory of personality, a methodological perspective, and a school of psychotherapy. Let us now take a look at Freud's views. He had his early training in medicine, neurology, and also in what would now be called clinical psychology. In other words, he was dealing with patients. He was deeply influenced by Darwin's theory. He was mentored by another psychoanalyst called Joseph Breuer, who dealt with patients with psychological disorders. But in Joseph Breuer's time, given the kind of methods that he used and the approach that he adopted, perhaps he would not have been labeled as a psychoanalyst. But all of this exposure to Sigmund Freud enabled him to view psychological processes in a way that was very different from that of existing schools of thought. Here are the major propositions that will tell us very clearly how the Freudian view and ultimately the psychoanalytic views differed very fundamentally from all those of the other schools that we have been talking about. First of all, according to Freud, psychology is the study of the unconscious. Now, here a comment is needed. When William James, if you recall, who was a functionalist, talked at length about what he called consciousness or conscious experience, he also made a distinction between what are called different states of consciousness or levels of consciousness, and indeed the unconscious level was one of these levels. However, none of the other psychologists attributed to this unconscious level of experience the kind of importance that Freud had attributed. The second point that Freud made was that behavior that we see from outside is actually motivated by inner instinctual drives, and the basic drive that sums up this motivation was described as sexual energy with this label libido. In other words, what we see from outside in any individual is actually motivated by this biological force called libido. The unconscious is a vast storehouse of what Freud called repressed desires, repressed fears, or conflicts between a person's needs on one hand and society's rules, requirements, and expectations on the other. In making a structural as well as functional analysis of the unconscious, Freud came up with these three components, which are now very famous, namely the id, the ego, and the superego. Each of these components proceeds in terms of functioning on a different principle. The id is supposed to be functioning in keeping with what is called the pleasure principle. The ego functions in terms of the reality principle, and the superego functions on the basis of something called the morality principle. Once again, the details about these components of the unconscious will be dealt with at great length when we get into the theories of personality. Next, libido develops with age, according to Freud, and gets expressed in different forms of behavior. In fact, the developmental aspect of Freudian theory was given special importance, and he named it psychosexual development, in contrast to, for instance, psychosocial development, as was made famous by another Freudian or neo-Freudian called Erik Erikson. Another concept that Freudian theory is famous for is what are called ego defense mechanisms. Freud provided a long list of psychological mechanisms which, he said, are employed at the unconscious level by the individual in order to relieve anxiety. So how does this anxiety arise according to Freud? He went through great details and told the world how, because the id would not agree with the superego, and the ego has to play the role of peacemaker, the conflict between the id and the superego, the id and the ego, and the superego and the ego is likely to create a kind of discomfort that the person may not be aware of at all at the conscious level, but this kind of discomfort or anxiety is definitely operating at the unconscious level, and it may be responsible for many kinds of disorders which appear at the conscious level. In order to get rid of this anxiety, or at least to reduce it to a manageable level, the individual adopts at the unconscious level a set of defense mechanisms, and many defense mechanisms were listed. These once again will be taken up at great length when we get into our discussion of psychoanalysis as a personality theory. In addition to what has already been said, multiple concepts were proposed in Freudian theory, but overall, the whole theory did turn out to be a well-structured, systematically laid out theory, and one has to give Freud the credit for coming up with something as creative as the kind of ideas that he proposed. It is also said that psychoanalysis should not be taken only as a theory for people who have psychological problems or disorders. In fact, a distinction is made between psychoanalysis as a theory for the neurotic mind as well as for the normal mind. In addition to the other aspects, Freud proposed that the methods used by the other schools assumed that what was studied at the conscious level depicted the reality of psychic processes. On the contrary, Freud actually believed that what is called reality can be known only by using methods that bring out unconscious level processes rather than concentrating on what appears from outside. He proposed that methods should be adopted such as dream analysis, free association, hypnosis, the psychoanalytic interview, and sometimes analysis of slips of the tongue and pen. Most people who are not serious believers of psychoanalytic theory would agree that many of the reports or narratives that we get based on dream analysis are too dramatic to be believed in, and yet they do hold some vestige of truth that cannot be ignored completely. Many criticisms were leveled against psychoanalysis. In fact, it may not be erroneous to say that just as psychoanalysis became a very famous theory, it was equally famous for being criticized and shot down by many scientifically inclined psychologists. Let us see what the points of criticisms actually were. It has already been pointed out that the theory was very systematically structured, but then many agreed that it was too dramatic. Of course, Freud would not agree with this criticism. Secondly, none of the propositions could be proved to be either true or false. Now, this is a necessary condition for any theory to be called scientific. So, because of this element in psychoanalytic theory, it did not fit at all into scientific inquiry. Nothing could be proved empirically or shown empirically. Third, too much importance was given to early childhood experience, and the significance of later life experiences was strongly devalued, at least by Freud himself. But then Freud had other students who developed theories who compensated for this lack of significance of later life experiences and did highlight what a person can become as a result not of what happens in their early childhood, but more because of what happens in later life. Fourth, there was an overemphasis on biological aspects and very little attention was paid to social factors. But to be fair to Freud, it is true that after his intensive study of various cultures, he did bring in the socio-cultural element in his theory. Fifth, there was too much emphasis placed on the negative side of human nature. It is said repeatedly that Freud was responsible in a sense for pointing attention to the darker side of human beings, making them aware of things like aggression, jealousy, and so on, and that created a lot of damage to the conceptualization or the worldview of what human beings are really. The criticism on this count comes most strongly perhaps from the humanistic perspective, who by contrast would like to emphasize the positive in human nature. Psychoanalytic methods can never be validated. Now, this is a very serious limitation because inferences based on so-called psychoanalytic methods would depend on the psychoanalyst's skill and interpretation rather than on something that is actually happening there. Now, if this kind of situation exists with some methods, it reduces objectivity. The offshoot of psychoanalysis was neo-Freudian theories, which to some extent took care of many of the limitations that were found in original Freudian theory. And this was one noticeable impact, that was the emergence of neo-Freudian theories such as those given by Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, Erik Erikson, and many others. All of these theories incorporated the role of social factors. In addition, many assessment techniques involving psychoanalytic concepts were devised, and they do deserve some credit. In contemporary research, links are now being established between some Freudian concepts and brain functioning. One cannot be sure that these attempts have always been successful, and yet such attempts do continue to take place. Having gone through all these different schools of thought in psychology and having traced the history of psychology, one question that we may now ask is, what is the state of contemporary psychology? This represents an overview of the schools of psychology. Let us go through some of the major points. First of all, it is noticeable that the accepted definition or approach to psychology in the contemporary scenario is that it is the scientific study of mental processes, behavior, and individual differences. It is not as though all theorists study all aspects of what have been mentioned here, and yet all three are supposed to be legitimate components of the discipline called psychology. No single school is dominant, and this is often referred to as the eclectic approach. If some psychologist wants to become a member or follower of a particular school of thought, there is no binding that he should not do so. In fact, many psychologists do choose their own approaches, and very often it turns out to be a combination of more than one idea proposed by more than one school. Instead of schools in their original form, diverse perspectives may be adopted, and in fact some of these have already been mentioned. Just to reiterate them, we have the behavioristic perspective, the cognitive perspective, the evolutionary perspective, the cultural perspective, the psychodynamic perspective, the humanistic perspective, or variations of these perspectives. There is now greater variety in method. A distinction is also made between qualitative and quantitative approaches when it comes to method. More about this will be said when we take up our discussion of method. With technological advances, experimental methods have become very sophisticated. We not only have computerized or virtual experiments, but for researchers who want to work in the field, there are fancy cameras that can take pictures of whatever is going on, so that the role of subjectivity or human intervention creating any kinds of errors are minimized. There are now more links with other disciplines, notably computer science, economics, sociology, and medicine, and many more. Instead of the mechanistic SR approach that was popular for quite a long phase in the history of psychology, perhaps it would be correct to say that the present-day approach is closer to what can be called the SOR approach, although this need not be an acknowledged approach to be adopted. The SOR approach stands for Stimulus Organism Response Approach, and this phrase was made famous by R.S. Woodworth under the title Dynamic Psychology. Woodworth made his contributions at the time when functionalists were having sway over what was happening in psychology. Although the functionalists did not really have a very strong impact, Woodworth's ideas were carried through. O in this formula refers to organismic variables that mediate between the stimulus and the response if one must adopt this approach. But what it allows us to do is to include a wide range of factors that might in fact mediate between what refers to the stimulus or is the equivalent of the stimulus, and on the other side what is the equivalent of the response. So O or organismic variables would include cognitive, physiological, emotional, motivational, and personality variables. Further, there is strengthening of what we call scientific features, although this may evoke many questions. But in general, there seems to be a trend towards the scientificism of psychology, in the sense that more people would agree that psychology should be studied as a science, yet it does not preclude the possibility of inserting elements that may not be considered very exact, objective, or in that sense scientific. One example of a scientific feature is the adoption of an information processing approach in the case of some topics such as memory. There is also the emergence of more fields of psychology. As the need for extensive applications is recognized and the input of psychology is also felt, new fields are emerging as and when required. Yes, Puneet?
Ma'am, when did philosophy become psychology?
Okay. This is not a very easy question to answer, because as you will agree, history does not have any specific dates to indicate one phase ending and the other phase starting. But it's a safe statement to say that probably when the British empiricists came on the scene, that is when psychology got an impetus for becoming an independent discipline, independent from philosophy, and develop its own methods, its own tenets, and so on. So the answer would be something like, very roughly, probably at the time that British empiricists came on the scene.
What is the difference between structuralism and functionalism in psychology?
Now, these two schools of thought were partly famous. Structuralism was much better known than functionalism. One thing common to both of these schools was that they both believed that psychology is the study, the scientific study of the mind as well as consciousness. But that seems to be the only thing that was common to both schools. Yes, there was one other point that was common in terms of method, but the way in which that method was actively used also differed. The structuralists believed that mental processes and consciousness should be studied in what they call the elemental way, that is, by breaking it up into units. Now, this was a point that the functionalists were against. One noted functionalist, namely William James, always believed, and he proposed the idea that consciousness, first of all, is a stream, so you can't break it up. Yes. That was one point of difference. As I said, structuralists were in fact more prominent on the scene, and one reason for that was they studied various aspects of this broad process called perception. It's not as though functionalists did not study perception, but if you look at the kind of work and research that functionalists did, you really cannot say that there was this one particular process or one particular area where they made a contribution. So the two schools did differ. But yes, there was one other point that was common, and that is that both schools did not last for a very long time, but at least structuralists are remembered even today. Functionalists are also remembered, but to a smaller extent. They did a lot of application, something that structuralists did not do. So there were some points of difference in terms of how the two schools came forward and became familiar with everybody else on the scene.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Were the British empiricists were psychologists or philosophers?
Okay, very clearly they call themselves philosophers. But the reason why British empiricism as a school is always mentioned in the history of psychology is, first of all, because even though they were philosophers, the kind of ideas that they were talking about were very, very similar to some major ideas that psychologists were interested in. Primarily because those ideas were related very closely to what we call the mind or mental processes. But please remember, the methods that the British empiricists followed were exactly like what any other philosopher would do. So they cannot be called psychologists in that sense. Okay, so the answer to your question is they were definitely philosophers, but the kind of philosophers who proposed ideas that were very useful for the development of psychology as an independent discipline and a scientific one.
Your thoughts still exist, structuralism and
functionalism. It's structuralism and functionalism. Well, the answer is really not really, no. And certainly not in the form in which they existed when they came on the scene. One reason for that is, first of all, contemporary psychologists do not strictly believe in binding themselves into any one particular school of thought. Some do, but there are very few of them. In other words, the idea of belonging to a school of thought is not very much encouraged on the contemporary scenario. However, there would be people who would follow that tradition. So, for instance, research in psychophysics is being done, but if you look at the kind of psychophysics research that was done in the time of structuralists, I don't think there is anybody around, any scientist around, who would, strictly speaking, follow the same methods or the same kind of thinking. A lot of things have changed. So in general, we say that schools of thought as they were proposed in the past, and particularly structuralism and functionalism, really do not exist. There are some other schools of thought that do have some vestige. For example, psychoanalysis. Please.
As far as psychology and philosophy are concerned,
yes,
psychology is completely personal. Means an individual thought. It can be differ from person to person. Definitely, it will differ. My thought won't be same as his or his. So, but as far as philosophy is concerned, a group of person can follow the same philosophy, can support the same philosophy. They may have same kind of philosophy. Then how we can correlate these two, how we can take these two in equal footing?
Okay. The question, first of all, is not so much in terms of taking the two disciplines on the same footage, but in fact it's not true that psychologists do not have what we call a school of thought. In fact, the question that you are asking is really a question about schools of thought. When two individuals, whether they are in psychology or in philosophy, follow the same school of thought, that does not necessarily mean that at any one point in time they have the same thoughts going on in their mind. What a school of thought means, whether it is in philosophy or in psychology, is that they have defined the way in which they will study whatever they want to study in a particular way, following certain tenets. And in psychology, I would say following certain procedures, certain methods. they have something called a methodological approach. It is that which makes things common to a school. As far as this fact of individual differences goes, please note, in psychology, everybody has acknowledged it because it's out there in nature. No two individuals, whether they are plants or animals or human beings, are exactly alike. However, that does not mean that we cannot make general statements about certain mental processes. In fact, you will notice that in psychology that is done to a very great extent. There is one field called individual differences, which specializes in looking at generalizations related to individual differences. So, we are not denying the existence of individual differences, but what we are saying is that in spite of two individuals being dissimilar, they will be similar in some other respects as well. With this, we come to the close of our discussion of what psychology is all about, how history has changed different phases and different features in psychology, and where we stand now. In our next lecture, we will look at another aspect of psychology, the basic psychological processes that are being studied by contemporary psychologists, and we can have a lively discussion on that. Thank you.